Sarah's eyes snapped open to the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. The morning light, filtering through her curtains, painted her bedroom in a sickly reddish glow. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming, trapped in some surreal nightmare. The air around her felt heavy, clinging to her skin like a damp shroud. It was humid, oppressive, making every breath feel like dragging air through a soaked cloth. As her vision sharpened, the reality of her surroundings sent a chill crawling up her spine. Her once pristine white walls were gone, replaced by something entirely foreign and grotesque. They pulsed, alive, with a slick, organic sheen that reminded her of raw muscle turned inside out. Veins and capillaries threaded across the surface, dark and spidery, pulsating with a fluid that didn't look like blood. Small, fleshy protrusions dotted the walls, quivering with each rhythmic throb. It was as if her room had been swallowed whole and she was trapped inside a living organism. Sarah reached out instinctively, her fingers trembling. The wall's surface was feverishly warm, yielding slightly under her touch, as though she had pressed into rare steak. Her hand snapped back, her stomach churning in revulsion. Where she had touched, the wall dimpled inward, forming a small depression that slowly filled with a viscous, clear fluid. She let out a gasp, her mind racing to find any logical explanation for the nightmare unfolding around her. Her gaze darted to the bedroom door, her one escape route. But it, too, had changed. The wooden door she had passed through countless times was gone, replaced by an unsettling, fleshy orifice. It resembled a sphincter, rimmed with glistening cartilage. Tiny, tooth-like protrusions lined its edges, flexing in a grotesque rhythm like the tendrils of some deep-sea creature. "Mark," she called out, her voice cracking. "Mark, are you there?" The only response was the faint clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Relief surged through her, followed by a thin thread of hope. Mark was here. He could help her make sense of this madness. She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, but the screen was unrecognizable. It wasn't glass anymore, but a layer of translucent tissue, pulsing faintly as if it were breathing. Swallowing her fear, Sarah turned toward the fleshy doorway. Every instinct screamed at her to stay put, but she couldn't remain in the bedroom. The suffocating, rhythmic throbbing of the walls was closing in, threatening to overwhelm her. With a deep breath, she stepped forward. As she crossed the threshold, the fleshy opening contracted slightly, brushing against her arms with wet, ribbon-like tendrils. Her skin crawled at the sensation, but she pushed through, emerging into the hallway. The corridor she knew so well had transformed into a grotesque tunnel of living tissue. The walls undulated gently, their surfaces covered in hair-like cilia that glowed faintly in the dim light. Each step left a glowing trail behind her, as if the floor was absorbing her presence. The air grew thicker with every breath, carrying an overpowering stench of decay and something sweetly sickening. Her heart pounded as she passed the framed photographs lining the walls. They were still there, but their subjects had changed. Faces stared back at her, distorted and elongated, their eyes replaced by black, gaping voids. Mark's face in their vacation photo moved, slowly turning toward her. She stumbled back, her breath hitching, and pressed on toward the kitchen, her only anchor of normalcy. Sarah's stomach churned as she stepped into the kitchen. It was unrecognizable, the familiar countertops and appliances twisted into something otherworldly. The cabinets had become clusters of bone-like structures, their surfaces slick with a thin layer of mucus. The air hummed with an unsettling energy, punctuated by the wet, rhythmic beating she had first heard in the hallway. Mark stood at the counter, his back to her. Relief and dread mingled as she saw him, moving in a strangely mechanical rhythm. He was arranging plates on the counter, over and over again. But the plates weren't plates anymore. They were thin, concave sections of bone, their edges sharp and glinting in the dim light. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank God you're here. Something's wrong. We need to leave. Now." He turned, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. His movements were jerky, unnatural, as though something unseen was manipulating him like a marionette. His face, once warm and familiar, was twisted into a grotesque mask. His smile stretched too wide, revealing rows of serrated teeth like a shark's. Dark fluid seeped from his eyes, trailing down his cheeks like tar. His skin glistened with the same organic sheen as the walls, rippling unnaturally as if something moved beneath the surface. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice a wet, gurgling rasp. Bubbles of black liquid formed at the corners of his mouth as he spoke. "The apartment is hungry. And you're its newest tenant." Sarah's legs refused to move as Mark stepped toward her, his too many jointed hands reaching out. "Don't worry," he cooed, his voice a mockery of reassurance. "The absorption process only hurts until you stop being you." Behind her, Sarah heard the sickening sound of tissue knitting together. She turned, horrified, to see the last exit sealing itself shut. The hallway's walls pulsed faster, their rhythmic beating growing more frantic. From deep within, she heard a low, wet rumble, like the sound of something massive stirring to life. "Mark, please," she begged, her voice a desperate whisper. "This isn't you. We can fight this. We can get out of here." But Mark only smiled, his too wide grin stretching impossibly further. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his voice barely human. "The house, it's not just a place. It's alive. And now, so are you." The walls around her began to close in, their movements slow but deliberate. The wet, rhythmic sounds grew louder, and Sarah's vision blurred as panic set in. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the living house as it began its final act of consumption. Sarah's world descended into chaos, a swirling maelstrom of sensations. Her body felt like it was dissolving, her skin merging with the pulsating walls. The boundaries between herself and the house blurred until she couldn't tell where she ended and it began. Her consciousness flickered, memories flashing like shards of broken glass. She remembered the first time she and Mark had stepped into the apartment, filled with hope and dreams for their future. The laughter, the arguments, the quiet moments of love, all of it felt so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else. Time lost meaning as Sarah's essence was pulled deeper into the house. She saw glimpses of its past tenants, their faces twisted in agony and resignation. They reached out to her with spectral hands, their voices a cacophony of warnings and laments. "It takes everything," one whispered. "You'll be part of it forever," another moaned. In the depths of her despair, Sarah's mind found a fragment of clarity. She realized that the house wasn't just consuming her body, it was feeding on her memories, her identity, everything that made her who she was. If she could hold on to something, anything, she might find a way to fight back. Clinging to the memory of Mark's laugh, the sound of his voice before it all went wrong, Sarah focused all her willpower. She pushed against the overwhelming tide, refusing to let go of the fragments of herself. The house reacted violently, its walls convulsing as if in pain. The faces of past tenants screamed silently, their expressions twisted with rage and despair. Sarah's surroundings blurred, and for a moment, she thought she might break free. But the house was relentless. It tightened its grip, pulling her deeper into its pulsating core. She felt her memories slipping away, one by one, until only a fragile thread of her identity remained. In the final moments before the house consumed her completely, Sarah's mind latched onto a single thought: if she couldn't escape, she would find a way to leave a part of herself behind. Summoning all her strength, she focused on that thought, imprinting it into the walls, the floors, the very essence of the house. Her scream echoed through the living structure, a final act of defiance. And then, there was silence. The house settled, its walls pulsing with a steady, rhythmic beat. To any outsider, it looked like an ordinary apartment, unassuming and quiet. But deep within its living walls, Sarah's essence lingered, a faint whisper in the darkness. She was part of the house now, but she had left a mark, a glimmer of resistance. And for the first time in its existence, the house felt something it had never known: fear.